Now, from the left coast, it's another podcast edition of The Peter B. Collins Show. Peter B. is curious, opinionated, and relentless in pursuit of the truth like a honeybee drawn to pollen. He's an independent progressive, ready to sting Republicans and Democrats alike when they deserve it. After years in commercial radio, Peter B. welcomes you to this audio adventure in news and politics with no corporate filter. Listeners support this program, and you can help at peterbcollins.com. Here's your humble host, Peter B.
Hey, what kind of shape is your stomach in? Do you know about gut health? About microbiomes? Well, I learned a lot by reading a new book called What's Making Our Children Sick, and in a moment, you'll meet the co-authors, Michelle Perro, a medical doctor, and Vince Ann Adams, a medical anthropologist. And what they show is that today's children are afflicted with many difficult medical conditions that are related to their diet, environment, exposure to pesticides like glyphosate or Roundup. It was a real eye-opener for me, and I think it should be for you too. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you who've subscribed to the Peter B. Collins podcast. People like Bill Goodacre, Robert Litweiler, and Paul Lacombe and Sandra Fish. They're staunch supporters of this podcast, and I invite you to join them. Just visit peterbcollins.com. You click on the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. It takes you to the sign-up page where you've got choices. So pat your tummy and sit back and listen. I think you'll find this fascinating. Today on the Peter B. Collins podcast, we're going to talk about our tummies, our guts. And while we have no corporate sponsors here at the Peter B. Collins podcast, I'm opening with an Alka-Seltzer commercial from 1966.
Calms the nervous feeling, relieves heartburn, relieves the stuffy feeling, and relieves a headache. Fact is, today, in 1966, nothing works better than good old Alka-Seltzer.
And the Alka-Seltzer commercial includes a tune called No Matter What Shape My Stomach's In, an instrumental hit from the early 1960s. Joining me here at the studio today are two women who have published an important new book called What's Making Our Children Sick. Michelle Perro is a medical doctor. She's a pediatrician with quite a bit of experience, over 30 years. And she describes herself as a fan, or she's practicing integrative medicine, including Western pharmaceutical-based interventions as well as many other approaches. And she describes her approach as food-focused. And she has been involved with the Benioff Children's Hospital in Oakland and has her own practice in Marin County, California. Dr. Perro, welcome.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to talk with you. And returning to our program is Vince Ann Adams. She's professor and vice chair of medical anthropology at the University of California, San Francisco. It's not her first visit here to the Peter B. Collins podcast. 3.5 years ago, it seems like, much less. She was here to talk about her book about the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Markets of Sorrow, Labors of Faith, New Orleans in the Wake of Katrina. And I learned a lot from that book, and I learned a lot from this book. Dr. Adams, good to have you with us today.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be back.
And I have to say that, I mostly talk about news and politics, and so getting into science, medicine, nutrition, these things, it's a little bit of a stretch for me. And I also want to acknowledge to listeners that I've led a bit of a charmed life. I've never had any serious medical problems. I have never battled cancer or any major gastrointestinal problems. And so this book really opened my eyes because I've just been on cruise control, never really investigated my microbiome, didn't even know what that meant till till I cracked your book. So let's start with just a couple of definitions and descriptions before we dive into the important topics in your book. What is my microbiome, Dr. Pero?
Happy to explain that with you because truly, Peter, it is the cutting edge of medicine at this time. We are a collection of microorganisms that inhabit our bodies, and in some cases we're mostly microbial. Some cases we have more than 10 to 1 microbes to human cells. In some cases it's 1 to 1. It's very individual. And these microbes we've evolved with over time. As a matter of fact, our mitochondria were once microbes that we've enveloped, and we've created this symbiotic relationship with our microbiome. They are those bacteria, and there are many phyla, many groups that cohabitate our bodies, are responsible for many jobs, including detoxification, production of certain vitamins, certain nutrients, some chemicals called neurotransmitters. They're also involved with signaling the immune system, especially at birth, super important. And they do so much for our bodies. And when they're out of balance, it can create disease.
And Dr. Adams, are my microbiomes different from yours?
Well, in some part they're very different probably, and in some part they're very similar. What we know about the microbiome in terms of populations and similarities is that where you live has something to do with it. Your genetics have something to do with it. Your family has something to do with it. And what you eat has something to do with it. So and we don't know that much about the microbiome yet, but we're learning more every day. And the thing that we really care about is the fact that the food you eat really has an impact on your microbiome.
Yeah. Well, as I read the book, my stomach would occasionally rumble, and I just thought, wow, there's a lot going on down there.
Indeed. There's a university happening right below.
And what's the best comparison to describe the complexity? I mean, people are familiar with the complex nature of computers and, digital systems. What metaphor do you use to describe the complexities and the activities going on in the gut?
The way I look at it, Peter, is that the microbiome is now being identified as its own organ. And I like to look at it as another organ in your biological system that they all communicate together. We are just not a lung and a kidney and a brain. We are a system. And I like your computer analogy. It's somewhat similar, but it's more complex in that our biology is not linear. There are many reactions that are going back and forth between all these systems. I do like to think of it as its own little university down there. They communicate. They do something called quorum sensing, and it's becoming clearer every day how they communicate. Those organisms are savvy, and they need to keep in check. They can get out of control if we don't eat the right nutrients to feed our microbiome.
And in the book, you point out that the widespread use of antibiotics, both in the food chain and as prescription drugs given to humans for specific conditions, that antibiotics attack the microbiome. Is that right?
Right. I mean, I think the metaphor I would have used is the soil. And it's both in a literal and a metaphoric sense, actually, because the soil is healthy when it's got a lot of living organisms in it that are communicating with one another and keeping each other healthy. That symbiosis that Michelle talked about is really important. And when that balance is destroyed, you get unhealthy soil. And that is directly related to health because it's the soil that produces the environment in which healthy food is grown.
I was next going to ask for a definition of symbiosis, so who wants to take that one?
Well, I can take that on. Symbiosis is a relationship between us and our microorganisms, these microbial organisms, not just bacteria. They can be viruses and fungi as well that live in our biology, in our terrain, and we work synergistically. We feed them, and they feed us. So it's a very communal, balanced relationship. And we really want to keep that relationship in balance. And you don't want to have imbalances in the microbiome. And as Vincent was mentioning previously, this literature is coming out daily of the impact of alterations of the microbiome and how they're very sensitive to what we're putting in our mouths.
Now, based on the science that I've absorbed from television advertising, like the Alka-Seltzer commercial, bacteria are all bad. And we use antibacterial soap, and we see animation sequences of bacteria, and they're dark, evil characters who are there to, hurt us. But we need a good balance of bacteria in our microbiome. Is that correct?
Absolutely. We've convinced ourselves, well, it's not that historic actually, but since probably the 50s, that having hygienic and sterile environments is healthier, and in fact it's the opposite. We know this now. The more hygienic we make things, the less possibility we have for being exposed to bacteria that it turns out we need to have a healthy gut.
Mm-hmm. Now, I recently sprayed this fabulous Formica table that you're sitting in front of with 409. What did I do when I did that?
Oh dear, we have to do a little education here, Peter. Well, in addition to pesticides and herbicides, and we'll get into that, but there are other chemical toxicants in the environment that we don't fare as well with. And I'm not specifically aware of what's in 409. I can't imagine it's muy bueno for our health. But you want to keep that toxicant load down, because those little bugs in your gut are responsible for that first-line detoxification. And then your liver, your poor liver, which is so heavily overloaded to detoxify, it has to clear that stuff. And some of us do a better job than others. Adults can handle it a bit better. Children, not as well. Mm-hmm. So we want to keep the environmental toxicant and toxin exposure down.
That's not to say that you don't want to avoid bacteria that can be harmful. Mm-hmm. Certainly, if you're doing gardening with manure, you want to wash your hands and the food that comes out of that before you eat it. There are harmful bacteria, and there are uses for antibiotics, just like there are uses for household products that clean things. But the problem we're facing now, in the U.S. in particular, is that we've gone overboard to the cleanliness side and the hygiene side, and we're now figuring out through studies in the microbiome that we actually need exposures to healthy bacteria, and we have to live with healthy bacteria.
Yeah, but all the messages we get are use that Clorox wipe, because there are evil, invisible organisms that are just teeming on your counter, and you can't live with them. But how do we respond to that and get people to be rational about hygiene, because it has become something that is promoted out of context with the medical frame.
Hand washing is a beautiful thing, and hand washing from the 1800s has been shown to decrease infection rates in people for a long time. That's basically soap and water. So before we eat, we want to teach children we want to wash our hands. That's pretty clear. Keeping a clean countertop is a good idea, before you prepare foods. It's what chemicals that you use to clean that countertop that we question. For example, plain old vinegar and water is an excellent antibacterial and not toxic to us. We do very well with vinegar, particularly nice aged one over a salad. Lovely. But so that will clean your countertop. You don't have to use chemicals which are not well studied. Remember, a lot of these chemicals have not been studying the effect on health, and particularly when there are multi-chemicals, a multi-toxic load that we're ingesting or breathing in or absorbing. There are many ways to take in chemicals, mouth being one, hands being another, respiration being another. Your skin is a massive absorptive organ. So we want to reduce those chemicals in our environment. But here's an interesting concept. How about a modicum of common sense? So we want to employ common sense as well. Rinse that salad before you eat it. It doesn't have to be sterilized.
All right. Now, one of the other takeaways for me in the book, and for people who've studied human biology, you can make fun of me, but I always thought of the small and large intestines as pipelines. And it seems more accurate, particularly with the small intestine, to describe it as more of a leach field, where the food that is flowing through it, the nutrients are kind of absorbed by the walls, such as they are, of the small intestine. So take this away from me before I embarrass myself further. And Dr. Pero, explain the biology of the gut.
So the gut is everything from your mouth to your tush. It's a long transit system, and a lot of people do see it as like the cardboard tube inside your paper towels, and it's such a straight shoot from one end to the other. Oh, but not so fast. A lot of things are going on, and they happen at each part. Digestion begins in your mouth, for example. The esophagus kind of passes things along. That's all that really does. It's a little point between the mouth and where the stomach. The stomach has a digestive role by producing hydrochloric acid and certain enzymes that begin to digest your food. And it sort of turns things around. That little rumbling you were talking about earlier, it's a little digestive process happening. As you go into the small intestine, and that's where you'll see these finger-like villus projections, and they look like a big towel. And those, they're very important in the absorption of nutrients along those little villi. So nutrient absorption happens a lot in the small intestine, and there are certain microbes that also then inhabit along that small intestine to create absorption of nutrients. The colon has a different function, and that becomes a big holding tank as you pass things out through your cecum and out the anus. But there's a very specific circulation that happens at the colon called the enterohepatic circulation, and it's very specific to the colon. Now, the reason why I bring that up here, and this may be a bit off topic, is because constipation is such a big problem. So when you're holding things in that holding tank, this increased circulation goes right back to your liver. So toxic stuff that's sitting there that's waiting for you to poop out is being reabsorbed and passed back up. Mm-hmm. So you want to keep things moving. So along the entire chain, and I actually just heard recently, I like this analogy, 2 tennis court worth of length of our intestine. I think I just learned that yesterday. I like that metaphor.
I knew it was long and curly.
It's long and curly.
If you take the area surface altogether, it makes 2 tennis courts worth of space.
Right.
Wow.
That's how much absorption space there is.
It's
at
a
leach field.
It's a lot in there. So that's what it is. And you want to keep that system healthy because your immune function, among so many other things, comes from that system. 70% of your immune function comes from your gut. Mm-hmm. So if the gut's unhappy, your immune system is going to be unhappy. And actually, your brain function is going to be unhappy. It's all linked.
We're talking about the new book, What's Making Our Children Sick, subtitled How Industrial Food is Causing an Epidemic of Chronic Illness and What Parents and Doctors Can Do About It. Now, I've been fighting subtitle creep, but there's a lot in the title and subtitle of your book. And there's even a subtitle exploring the links between GM foods, glyphosate, and gut health. So we've got a lot to talk about here. And I want to point out that this is not a clinical or academic book. It's highly accessible. You have many real-life anecdotes and case studies from individuals that Dr. Pero has treated. And you just mentioned a moment ago about constipation. And in many of these cases that you detail in the book, the individuals present with constipation as one of the symptoms. And, I can certainly understand that. Anybody who's had a bout understands how all-consuming it can be, where you feel, I've got to go, but I can't. And it takes over your consciousness in many ways. And what you describe here is a much more systemic approach to childhood conditions that present, including the autism spectrum, including behavioral problems that surface, and many other conditions that we may get to talk about today. But fundamentally, what is kind of revolutionary is you talk about something that seems so obvious, and that is we are products of the food that we ingest. And it has more impact than just the time it takes to pass through our system. So tell us a little bit about how, over the years of your medical practice, you developed the insights and the expertise to approach these, chronic illnesses and other early childhood conditions that you talk about in the book.
Certainly, Peter. Because my background's in acute care medicine, so I'm very used to putting Band-Aids on issues, but as I even had my own kids with issues, particularly my son 24 years ago, I branched out into integrative medicine to learn how to handle my own son's issues because there weren't treatments in Western medicine. And that's how it all began. That's a very quick answer. Mm-hmm. So what I've learned through trial by fire and to kind of change my practice is what I've learned is if you don't get to the root cause when you're treating someone, you just treat symptoms, and treating symptoms is not good enough. And so if you don't understand why this child has simply constipation, you cannot cure them. The idea is not to go for improvement, it's to go for cure. It's to get to the root cause and to get for the cure. Just to use constipation as example, because 30% of all children have constipation, just about, and I believe it's probably more, and it's one of the leading causes of visits to specialists in pediatrics, gastroenterologist, is constipation. If kids are not pooping, and poo-poo and pee-pee is my world, I'm a pediatrician, then they have increased levels of toxicity. They can't get those toxins out. So before you treat, you have to get them pooping. Why aren't they pooping? Right? Everyone poops. It's because of their diet. It's the sad American diet, right? And that's what it's called. Standard American diet is a sad diet. There is a lack of vegetable matter in their diet. There's very little fiber, which is also food for the microbiome. And there are other things which we'll get into in their food as we kind of do a lead into the meat and the potatoes, no pun intended, of our book. If you don't give those kids fiber, and a lot of them don't want to eat the fiber, we were children once, I didn't love vegetables either, I don't think, then they're not going to poop, and they're not going to detox, and they won't feel well. You're right, it does impact their brain function. It makes them irritable, and they're cranky, and their tummies hurt, and they're bloated. Yeah. It's not a good feeling. So I'm not sure if I exactly answered your question, but that's sort of where you begin. When you, as a functional med doc, as an integrative physician, you begin with the gut. And I think we hammered that home, Vincent, in the book pretty well, starting with the gut.
And Dr. Adams, what drew you to this set of issues? You have a very diversified background. Your expertise is in comparing, Asian or Eastern medicine with the Western system. You've also studied self-immolation of Tibetans and the profiteering response to Hurricane Katrina. So what from your own background drew you to this?
So I would say the first thing is, I love a good story. And that Michelle had a great story. But I also had written for many years, and being a medical anthropologist, I had been paying attention to the relationships between politics and health in many different locations. And that, has led me to a lot of different kinds of projects. When I met Michelle and I started to get to know her, I started to learn more about her vision of what was going on with our children's health. Some of what she was talking about rang true for my own family and my own children. That was an eye-opener. And then, like a lot of people, when she started talking about things like genetic modification of foods, I didn't really believe her. I was very skeptical. Like most people, I went to the internet, I started reading about it, and I said, yeah, this is very controversial. It's not really clear that we know enough about it. And then the more I read about it and the more research I did, and when I got to the layers beneath, the more I realized that there was something really important going on here that needed further investigation. My initial impulse was I'd like to write a book about not only her theory and the nature of this political debate about food, but also about the kind of medicine that she practices and the fact that she's taking on the children who aren't getting cured anywhere else, the ones who are really at the ends of their ropes in terms of getting medical care with chronic conditions that they can't seem to cure. So I said to her one day when I was talking, you should write a book on this. And she said, I've been wanting to write a book for years. And I said, okay, a little more back and forth about how maybe to get someone to help her write the book, thinking about how I actually had a lot of interest in the things she was talking about. Even my work on Tibetan medicine kind of came to play because I know in Tibetan medicine, the first line of intervention and treatment is always to look at the food people are eating. And the fact that that's what she was doing was really interesting to me. And I finally said, I'd like to help you write this book. And so we started a collaborative project, interviewed a lot of her patients, went to a lot of events and political rallies and things like that, and spent a lot of time on the science, trying to get to the bottom of what could be said and what couldn't be said about this. And then, built this book, which was trying to connect the dots about the entire situation that we're in.
Now, let me just follow up on your skepticism about the link to GMO foods, because honestly, that argument feeds my bias. I'm not scientific about it. I haven't, looked at peer-reviewed science and all those things. But I feel like the industries that profit from GMOs, and Monsanto is the best known, but not the only one, that they've successfully obscured a lot of information, and just as the tobacco industry successfully delayed its day of reckoning by sowing confusion, and we see the climate change deniers use many of the same tactics. I've always felt that the industry can't be trusted, and that the critics are more credible than the apologists. So you have a science background, and I don't. What informed your skepticism, and then what changed it, Vince Ann?
Good question. I'm writing a second book about this. As a scientist, I would say that, I'm not a lab scientist, so I really, really had to read carefully and struggle and get help from other scientists in reading some of the material. My skepticism was from the basic information that you can gather and from my colleagues at the medical institution that would say, no, there's no evidence that this is really problematic. There's plenty of publications that say, whether you're talking about the impact on feed for livestock, or whether you're talking about the technology for modifying genes, or whether you're talking about the pesticides that are designed to go with these, there's plenty of information that says that they're safe. And yet, if you look hard enough, you find that there's plenty of information that says it's not. A lot of that work has been attacked and discredited by, it turns out, scientists from industry-funded institutions or who are directly in the industry. So when I started to look further, my skepticism started to melt a little bit. Then I started putting together the material from on the microbiome, working with Michelle on looking at those people who are trying to bridge the gap between what we do know about these foods and the biochemical processes that might be happening in the gut, and then the clinical symptoms that show up and the disorders that show up. And it just became a very convincing story. I will say we were very careful in the book to only use science that has been published in peer-reviewed journals, and to note where we are making leaps around some of the information that we have, trying to connect the dots. What we do say repeatedly is that we need more science. We need better science on this.
Well, I do think the book is balanced. Michelle Perot, did you have to compromise in this collaboration?
Yes, I did. I feel much stronger than what I put in the book, and I did that for the sake because there's what I practice and what I preach, and I know what goes on in the clinic, what I can do, and what we as clinicians do is we recognize patterns, right? And when I saw the research of a researcher there named Dr. Arpad Pusti, who was one of the first scientists in Europe who was asked to look at the genetic modification process. And when I saw histopathology slides of the guts of rats who were fed GM potatoes, and this was before it was introduced in Europe, I had a clinical aha moment. And I was able to relate that research, from the first research that I've ever seen, with what was happening to children. I had a quick clinical kind of marriage in my mind, like, oh my God, I get it. And periodically, as clinicians, we are blessed when we get a moment like, oh my God, really? And you get it. And that doesn't always happen. So when I went back and looked at Dr. Pusti, who is one of my heroes, and we talk about quite a bit in the book, what happened to him was shocking. His world collapsed after he announced that what his findings were. He was asked to announce them. He was a very shy man. 2 days later, his lab closed. Bill Clinton calls Tony Blair, and you could imagine people were all over him. And he tells his story in a movie called Scientist Under Attack. And then it was later to become the Pusti affair. And many scientists were attacked that way after. And as a critical thinker, not as a clinician, but as a critical thinker, it's like, why? You have all this great science. You have great science. What happens is you repeat it. And you hold the product. You don't bring it out in like gangbusters. You hold it and you repeat his studies. That's what normally would have happened. But no, he got shut down. He was shamed. He got sick afterwards. And he talks about this himself. I'm not sharing. This is no HIPAA violation here. He got sick. He talks about it. And so when I saw that, I started making changes right away. And what are we asking to do? Change kids' diets? I mean, really. Now, and let's not be naive. I do a lot more than change a kid's diet. I do all kinds of intervention tools because I see chronically ill children. I'm not seeing well children. I see sick kids. But what we did start to see, and I saw it in my own practice, that family members were getting better too who were not my patients.
Yes.
And that was an eye-opener. And I mean remarkably better, where I was shocked. And my husband, who's a doc, I'd go home and tell him, I'd say, you're not going to believe this. And he'd say, oh, come on. I'm like, look at the data. Here is this guy's lab test. Oh, my God. And I, too, had skepticism that I couldn't believe. Like, really? Is it this profound? And I saw it over and over again. So when I look at a study, of 20 rats, and I've treated a few thousand patients in the past 11 years since I even became aware of this issue. Before 2006, I had no knowledge of what genetically modified food was or what it was doing. I would have to say, embarrassing little knowledge about it. It's not in pediatric literature. It's not in medical literature. And so this shift in my practice was profound. So I know what the problem is, but as Vincent and I work together, our goal was to get it out to the reluctant constituencies, as we called it in the book, and to people who are doing the eye rolling every time we say, oh, GMO food, genetically modified food, is to get out to those people, because my patients know.
Well, I'm going to recommend this book to a number of adults who I know. The focus is on children, but the microbiome and the impact of a bad gut, a leaky gut, these are the things I learned from your book. They afflict many adults who I know. And I don't think their doctors have ever approached them about diet as a factor. And in each of the anecdotes in your book, it presents pretty much consistently that it's a very dedicated mother. There are a couple of fathers who are mentioned along the way, but it is predominantly the mom who is fighting for her child and who is fighting against a doctor or a type of medical practice that has not produced any resolution to the very serious issues that this mother is presenting with her child. And what strikes me is the courage, the persistence, the sheer determination of these mothers, but they often overlook their own role in what they feed their child. And it seems that with each there is this initial aha moment where you say, well, yeah, we're going to look at this, this, and this, but the first thing I want you to do is, get the glutens out, get the dairy and, other things that from your experience contribute to a bad gut.
Well, Peter, that's where the patient-doctor relationship comes into play. Some of these moms, and they often are women coming in, and I practice here in Marin, is when they come in, they are so desperate for a solution. And when you share their experience and lab testing you want to do, you do testing. You show these folks what's going on. And if they can trust what you say is to be true, there's that confidence. And what I say is give it 4 weeks. Can you commit to 4 weeks? Come back in 4 weeks and let's see how your kid is doing. The majority come back and they show improvement in issues that were not fixable, in quotes, my little fingers are waving in the air, prior. So this is the very typical physician-patient relationship. There has to be trust that they understand that I know what I'm doing. I don't always know what I'm doing. I say my best guess is, based on my clinical experience, based on what I've read, based on what my colleagues say, based on the conferences that we are attending, and let's try this. Some of our interventions are very harmless for children. They'll work or they won't. We're not giving massive pharmaceuticals or cancer drugs here. Some of the treatments are with minimal risk and actually quite affordable.
In the book, you note in the introduction that today 1 in 13 American children has a serious food allergy, and that's an increase of 50% over the last 20 years. 9% of kids have asthma, dramatic increases in the rates since 1980. 1.6 million Americans have Crohn's disease or colitis. 1 in 10 of those is a child. Roughly 1 in 140 Americans has celiac disease, and that has increased 4.5 times over the past 50 years. And on that note in particular, I'm one of those people who doesn't have any sensitivity to gluten. I have very few dietary sensitivities. And so I thought some of my friends were overreacting when they said, well, I'm going gluten-free, and I only patronize this gluten-free bakery. And, I said, well, really, did you have serious problems? And many of them I thought were, following daytime TV hosts who created an exaggeration of the extent of the problem. So give me an honest evaluation of celiac and who should be conscious of gluten in their diet.
So celiac is a genetic disease, and those patients people cannot eat gluten at all, 100%. And the celiac is an autoimmune issue, and that can have devastating effects not only on the gut function, but it's related to other issues as well, such as diabetes and psoriasis and other autoimmune diseases. So those people need to be off gluten. So we have the celiacs, but we also have people who are gluten intolerant, or we call it gluten sensitivity. And what that is likely linked to is this increase in intestinal permeability that we're seeing. And that intestinal permeability is a direct consequence from what we believe to be from glyphosate and its effect on the microbiome as well as on the actual gut itself, in addition to the effect of the genetic modification process. Mm-hmm. So when that gut becomes inflamed and you develop intestinal permeability, foods such as gluten are incompletely broken down, and they pass through these leaky intestinal openings, these junctions, because the little cells, the little sentinels that's lying are not doing their job. They pass into your bloodstream incompletely broken down to these little 7 amino acid, not broken down enough, and your immune system sees them as foreign invaders. And so what they can do is your immune system can mount a food sensitivity, which is a low-grade immune response to that gluten. And those are antibodies such as IgG and IgA, which are low-grade immune antibody responses. But what can also happen to these little molecules that are floating around in your bloodstream, they get transported up to your brain. They cross your blood-brain barrier, which is not impermeable. It's quite permeable. And they can bind to certain receptors in your brain, the same receptors that opiates bind to. And they produce that loving feeling. And that's why people say, I can't give up bread. I love bread. It's a chemical reaction. And so those people are not crazy. The gluten people out there. It's not another Marin crazy phenomenon. It's a real thing happening. And by the time I left, where I was working previously at an integrative clinic, 95% of the kids I was seeing of chronically ill children, this is not well children, had intestinal permeability and elevated levels of these antibodies. It was astounding.
Wow. So, this really helps because connecting the gluten sensitivity to glyphosate and its, pervasive use, that really adds to my knowledge because my sense was that these are people who were oversensitive and overdiagnosing themselves. But let me turn that around. Would I feel better? Would my health improve? And I'm pretty healthy already. If I gave up gluten products?
Possibly. I mean, you sound like a pretty hardy soul. You've got good genetics, good epigenetics. That's good. You're doing something right, Peter. I hate to mess with a system that's working. But often people don't recognize that they feel even better when they give this a try. Mm-hmm. And so people say, I came off gluten 3 days. I didn't notice any change. Well, for some of us, it's not 3 days. Some people it is. The more sensitive you are, the more profound and quicker you'll see a response. You have to give it about 4 weeks. It takes about 4 weeks to clear those IgG, IgA antibodies from your body, which are inflammatory and can cause other symptoms. And if you do for 4 weeks, you might want to do a little experiment with yourself and see how you feel. After 4 weeks, you don't notice a difference. I say you're one of those lucky, go have a nice croissant. I haven't eaten gluten myself in about 6 years now, and I feel great off of gluten personally. It's really individual, and that is another key point of integrative medicine. It's individual.
Yeah.
But I think it's fun to do a little experiment. You can be part of our gluten-free tribe.
Okay, I'll give it a try. Dr. Adams?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in and say, a lot of it may have something to do with what you're eating otherwise, which determines how healthy your gut is and your microbiome is. But people might not know what glyphosate is. We haven't really opened that up
Roundup.
yet. And it's Roundup.
Yeah.
And with the thing about genetically modified foods is the most common kind of genetically modified food is that which is called Roundup Ready, which means it's enabled, it's possible to be grown with the use of massive amounts of Roundup. And as weed resistance has increased over the years, the more and more Roundup is being used on these crops. So foods in general, if you're not eating organic, probably have a high content of glyphosate in them. And so if you're eating a really organic diet already and you're careful about what you eat, you're probably going to have a healthy gut. The other thing to note about glyphosate in wheat is that genetically modified wheat is not in commercial use right now. There is research being done on it. But that is not the problem with wheat. The problem with wheat and glyphosate seems to be there's a fairly high amount. We don't know exactly how much, but there's controversy about it. Glyphosate or Roundup is being used as a desiccant on wheat just before it's harvested so that it won't sprout again. And that may be one way that that glyphosate is getting into wheat, and that's why wheat is causing problems for some people. The other thing about wheat or gluten is that it has a particular relationship with the gut in the sense that it likes to hold open more passages in the gut. Genetically, it's designed to do that so that things pass through more. So if one of the main researchers of leaky gut is a man named Alessio Fasano at Harvard University, and he argues that even though celiac is a genetically caused disease, what we're seeing is more and more people who have sensitivities to wheat that start making it look like they have a form of celiac.
Interesting. The other point that you make in the book is that the development of Roundup, the Roundup Ready seeds, and this whole cycle turns food into a pesticide.
Yes.
Explain that.
Yeah, well, the two most common forms of genetic modification that are used in our crops in the U.S., and these are the big commodity crops, soy, corn, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa, which is used for animal feed. Are first Roundup Ready seeds, which are, as I said, designed to be used with a pesticide so that the plant won't die, but it will absorb massive amounts of Roundup, and all the other weeds around it will die. And the other type is something called BT Ready seeds, which is an interesting effort that was made on the part of Monsanto originally to reduce the amount of insecticide that was needed to grow crops. And they did this by figuring out how to insert into a plant an insecticide. So they modified the plant so that every single cell in the plant would have a protein that, when eaten by an insect, would kill the insect. And the way that it kills the insect is by when it's ingested, the protein actually creates, in a simple sense, it creates holes in the lining of the gut, and then allows the animal to die by way of a kind of septicemia. They originally argued that that would not happen in human guts because of the different pH that humans have with insects, but what we now know, and we don't know what effect this has, but we're suspecting that it does have a big effect, is that the Bt toxin that is inserted into the plant to make it an insecticide is actually pre-activated. So the question of what it's doing in human guts is being studied by a number of researchers, many of whom are attacked by industry. But it seems that the Bt actually does have an impact on health in a number of ways.
Recently, I shared with my listeners an interview with Larry Bragman, who is here in Marin County. He serves on the Water District Board, and he's been fighting to end the use of glyphosate on the watershed. One of the confounding issues is that despite the general awareness of the risks and the reports of carcinogenic impacts of glyphosate, is that the public continues to buy it in large volumes.
It's huge.
And so people are saying, get that off my watershed because I need it on my own property.
Right.
So this is the interesting thing about this. There are non-toxic alternatives to using Roundup. And the 750 products that contain glyphosate being the active ingredient in Roundup. And they're out there, and some of them are vinegar based, and some of them are involved using hot water and steam. And a friend and a farmer and one of the most knowledgeable people is working on a product as we speak. His name is Howard Vlieger. He's an international speaker on this topic. We were with him yesterday in Sacramento. It's funny you should bring this up because we were in Sacramento just yesterday asking our legislators if they would consider a bill to ban glyphosate around areas where children are, schools, daycares, and parks. Waterways would be ideal as well because glyphosate has a very long half-life. This idea that it's sprayed and is gone is erroneous. The average half-life is 35 days, and as we learned yesterday, it can last up to 22 years. And it's absorbed in the soil, and it creates an unhealthy soil because it also affects the microbiome of the soil. It's an antibiotic. Monsanto patented it as an antibiotic in 2003, and they received the patent approval in 2010. And so it has an effect on the soil microbiome in addition to our own. So we support Larry Bregman's work here. It should be banned. There are non-toxic alternatives, and one will be out shortly.
Mm-hmm. I want to turn to a part of the book that I found fascinating, and I want to couch this properly. That you do see that food and these issues that we're describing, the health of the gut, are related to some of the extremes on the autism spectrum. And I want to be careful about this because I'm not describing this as a cure, and you don't in the book. But you have several studies or case histories where you describe children who present who have been diagnosed on the spectrum, and that you're able to address diet and related issues that reduce some of the expression of their autistic tendencies. Is that a correct way to sum that up?
Peter, indeed that is. We are very careful in the book not to offer treatments but to show examples of how this can help children on the spectrum, which is now affecting so many kids, 1 in 43 boys, 1 in 68 kids. So and it's on the rise possibly as well. So children on the spectrum have some of the worst guts that I've seen, and that's actually reported in the literature. They have extreme inflammation of their guts. They are mostly gluten and dairy sensitive. And they have other issues as well as many digestive enzyme issues with bad absorption of nutrients. They have low levels of nutrients. They have many issues concurring focused on the gut. When you put them on an organic food diet, when you take out gluten and dairy, when you begin to do some restoration of the microbiome, when you restore their low nutrients, if you remove toxins and toxicants and heavy metals and other things that they may have, they get better, and it's remarkable. The one case that we talk about in the book is the boy with autism who had other things and co-infections because they're sick, their guts are not working. That boy was the one whose dad, who had renal failure, significant renal failure, 20%, he was heading for dialysis, like his brother and his mom, and he lived in a heavily sprayed area in Central California. His renal function went from 20% to 80%. And he became off his hypertensive drugs, and his hypertension resolved. That was profound. So the child with autism got better, dad got better, and so it'd be naive to say that, I just changed his diet. That's not what I did. I did a lot with that boy over 2 years, but the changes were remarkable. And we have another young lady who got remarkably better in the book as well.
Yeah. And what about environmental factors? Exposure to spray, you made a passing reference to that, but people who live in agricultural communities or even next to a golf course where they think that they're, in the lap of luxury and everything is fine, but also the history of a certain geographical location where there may have been some source of toxins that now has a McMansion built over it.
Right. And this is a big issue. I mean, Michelle talks often about patients who, are facing really serious challenges. They might change their diet in their house, but they're still living in an area where they're getting exposed quite often. And just cycling back to this glyphosate issue, it was a surprise to me to realize that what we're really facing is a monumental epidemic. And it's not just an agricultural issue. Certainly in agriculture, the use of glyphosate has increased immensely, but it is a household product. And it's being sprayed in cities as well, on parks. And, it gets into the soil, it gets into the water system. And, some of what we need to be thinking about is the need for new research on increased amounts of exposure to this. So what may have been studied 20 years ago and determined as safe because of the low levels of exposure that people were getting needs to be updated with increased research on people who are being exposed to massive amounts of it through multiple resources, multiple sites.
There's one reference to co-infections related to Lyme disease. And I have some friends who have, and I want to single out a listener in Montana who is facing, she's had chronic Lyme, I think, for 5 or 6 years now, and it is quite debilitating. Have you been able to see links either between diet or the environmental factors like glyphosate related to chronic Lyme?
Absolutely. People have always have asked me, as of last evening, chatting around with some friends, why the epidemic of chronic tick-borne infections? What's going on? Why are we seeing this explosion? And it is explosion. In the last year of my practice, I think I just saw patients with chronic tick-borne infections only, and intestinal permeability, and abnormal microbiome, and nutrient deficiency. So what's going on? And I suspect because of this massive amount of glyphosate, as well as other pesticides and herbicides as well, and the genetic modified food, that because of our gut impairment, and I think we all have it to a degree, because no one eats 100% organic, no one I know, it's very difficult, that our immune function has been impaired. And whereas we were probably getting these infections before, but we were able to clear them. And because of this chronic inflammation and systemic immune dysfunction, if you would, that we are unable to clear these infections, and it's real and it's rising, and so I thoroughly embrace these patients with chronic tick-borne infections. They're very sick, they're under-recognized, under-diagnosed, and under-treated, and if we clean up the diet and get them off glyphosate and genetically modified food, it helps. It will not cure them, but it definitely helps. It's a step to improving their gut health. Anything that will improve your gut health will ultimately improve the outcome of whatever issue that you're dealing with.
Also, it's important to remember that for diseases like Lyme, antibiotics are a resource. And Michelle certainly relies on those as well. It's not like she tries to cure everything through gut health. It's just the complementary practice of making sure the gut's able to even absorb the medicines that are being given and make use of them.
So there's much more in the book, and I want to recommend it for, as I said, adults and for parents who are confronting serious medical issues with your children. But what are the unknowns that this book project left you with? What remains to be studied? And do we have the dedication, determination, and resources to properly examine this whole area? Because it's clear from our discussion that we're at the early stages of understanding the microbiome and its impact on our entire body system. And I'm just curious if you think the medical establishment takes this as seriously as you do.
I can jump in there. I would say that, this is the biggest hurdle. This is such an interesting phenomenon in the sense that something like 80 to 90% of scientists don't think there's anything wrong with genetically modified food. About 90% of the public wants labeling of GM foods. So there's this polarization happening around who believes
I think at minimum that GMO tomatoes should have a label that says no flavor here.
Right, there's a whole book on that tomato. So there's this really strange phenomenon where there's this disjunct between what the scientific establishment is saying and what the public wants, and suggests that they're mistrustful of the science. The medical community, I think, is a particularly important constituency because they're facing kids who are chronically sick and people who are chronically sick, and they're kind of at the ends of their resources around what they can do to help these people. So there is a need for a fundamental rethinking of the medical paradigm that we're using around the microbiome and around more ecosystem thinking about the relationships between soil, the quality of the food that's being eaten, and what the food does in the body. That is asking for a lot. At a minimum, I was hoping that this book would be a tool for people who are curious about this topic to go and find out what is actually being said and what genetically modified foods actually are, and to have access to some of the literature and the debates so that they can pursue that. For example, I teach in a medical school. I teach a lot of medical students. I would love them to be able to use this book to open their minds up to pursuing this. Medical institutions are incredibly slow to change. The guidelines for standard clinical practice are important and useful. They're based on evidence-based medicine, and the science hasn't really caught up with what we know from the bench. The medical science hasn't caught up with the bench science on this yet. And so anything that we can do to move that bar a little further to make those kinds of connections happen for medical students and clinicians in general, the better.
Michelle Pero?
I have a certain wish list. If I could look at this, one, I can't often delineate what's caused by GM food, what's caused by pesticides, and what's caused by both. I can't often delineate that clinically. I also cannot tell why certain individuals with just small amounts might be more sensitive than others. It often doesn't make sense to me. And I don't understand, because there's no research on this, how much it takes. Like, for example, if you have a person who's 95% organic and they eat one GM pesticide meal, that might topple them, but yet not another. So I have no research that helps me delineate exactly how much an individual can tolerate, because some of us can tolerate way more. I have no literature, no science on polychemicals. So when you have a kid who's exposed to plastics, solvents, air pollution, cigarette smoke from mom or dad, and GM food and pesticides, what that chemical soup does to their little bodies, there is no data. Also, what I need to create a healthy clinical population is studies that look at they take glyphosate or whatever pesticide or herbicide they're studying out of context. They don't use the actual formulation. So Roundup, for example, not to pick on Roundup, but it is heavily used.
Please do.
Please, I'll pick up on Roundup. The chemical formulation is much more toxic than glyphosate alone. Glyphosate in itself is not as toxic. When they add the inert, again, my fingers are waving in the air, Peter, for your listeners, which are surfactants that break down the cell membranes that allow glyphosate to enter the cells and make it more toxic. What glyphosate is actually doing in those cells is way worse than people think. How do we know that? When we talk about our farmer friend Howard, who we mentioned earlier, and we look at some of this pig data, cow data, horse data, it is shocking what the veterinarian community is seeing in our livestock and how much better these animals get when they're taken off GMO sprayed feed. It is profound. And we are not cows, but yet we share similar biologic systems. We have 90% common genetics with rats. Some of my best friends are rats. And so these are the things that I live with and that perturb me. And be clear, I know so much and yet I know so little. And I battle this all the time. And what am I really doing? What is really getting better? And people say, well, what worked? And sometimes, I don't know. Sometimes I treat someone and I don't know exactly what turned them around. Mm-hmm. Was it the supplement? Was it the diet? Was it the herb? Was it the vitamin? I don't know. Sometimes I'm not really clear, but sometimes it all works. And on the last comment, if I had any hope that when someone says, well, we need more science on this, and I say, don't my thousands of clinical cases constitute good science? as a clinician, isn't there validity in that? Do I need a placebo-controlled, double-blind rat study to prove this? Or can I show you in these thousands of children who are remarkably better? So I know that was a long-winded answer, but you've got my wish list for 2018.
All right. That's Dr. Michelle Pero, along with Dr. Vincent Adams. You got a final comment? We got time.
Well, I was going to say that, in addition to, we're doing the wish list. I mean, one of the goals I was hoping for in the book is to get people to understand that this is a public health disaster. This is not a question of individual choices about their diet. This is happening on a large scale. Many people are sick. It needs to be looked at as a larger political and social issue than just an individual clinical issue.
Vincent Adams, Michelle Pero, thanks for joining me today. I recommend the new book, What's Making Our Children Sick? It's freshly published by Chelsea Green, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. Nice to talk with you today.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for listening to this in-depth interview with Vincent Adams and Michelle Pero. I welcome your comments. Email Peter at peterbcollins.com.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.